So I tell Eric Uslaner to enter.
Good morning. Thank you, Bertola. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you for inviting me here. Yeah, okay, don't worry. And I'm delighted to share some of my thoughts on my new work, a book just finished, that is under contract to Cambridge University Press, that will try to deal with some of the issues that are confronting most Western societies as they become more diverse. And the core of social capital that I've been working on for well over a decade now is trust. It's the belief that most people can be trusted. It's important because it helps create bridging ties to people who may be different from ourselves, people we may not know who may be different from ourselves. So if I trust my wife, that really is not very interesting, or shouldn't be very interesting. But the more important thing is to be able to trust people we don't know, trust people who are different from ourselves. And this matters because once we do have this sort of trust, we get a more cooperative society, a more tolerant society. Trusting people are more tolerant of immigrants and minorities and support equal rights for women and gays. They believe that there is a common core of values, and basically, they also do more good in their communities. They volunteer, they give to charity as well. And trusting societies have better functioning governments, they have higher growth rates, less corruption and crime, and they're more likely to redistribute resources from the rich to the poor. Now, in a way, I sort of feel strange. As an American, which has now become a moderately low-trusting society, coming to one of the most trusting societies in the world, telling you what I know, basically, about you, and maybe why we are not doing it very well back home. Now, if trust really is all about having faith in people who are unlike ourselves, it's sort of unsettling to hear that there are arguments being made that diversity leads to less trust. In fact, Robert Putnam at Harvard and some other people have basically said that diversity is the cause of many of our social strains. There's also another literature that says diversity brings up a lot of good things. Increased wages, higher prices for rental housing, and also greater problem-solving capacities. And probably one of the classic examples of diversity having positive benefits is a company I'm sure everyone in this room knows very well, Google. Google puts in its workforce not only engineers, but also musicians and artists and philosophers to make sure that the engineers can get a broader worldview. So here is an example of diversity playing a very big role in creativity. But the literatures and the politicians, not just the academic literature, but the politicians, have said that diversity is a threat to social cohesion. After all, if not everyone looks alike, then maybe those people who don't look like the majority may constitute a threat to what the majority wants to do. Indeed, the British government has actually commissioned studies asking whether there is in fact a decline of Britishness in the United Kingdom. So what I'm going to argue is that diversity isn't the culprit. It's residential segregation. And when people live apart from each other, they're not going to be able to develop the sort of knowledge of other people, the sort of social ties with people of different backgrounds that can lead to greater trust and to greater productivity for society. In particular, there is a considerable literature on segregation that points to some of its really nasty consequences. The most important is diversity leads to inequality. No, sorry, segregation leads to inequality. And inequality is the single biggest factor leading to low levels of trust across societies, across the U.S. over time, and across the American states. Unequal societies have fewer trusting people in them because the rich and the poor don't see the world in the same way. They don't see their fates as linked to each other. So, how segregation leads to inequality is a key factor in why segregation leads to lower levels of trust and social cohesion more generally. Also, we see that segregation is linked to other negative outcomes for society. Worst outcomes for minorities on crime, education, and job prospects, which again are some of the things that people have said, well, minorities don't get involved in the job market quite so readily. A large part of this is the fact that they don't have the same sort of social ties because they don't live together with people who have these social ties. There's also another problem that comes about from segregation. When people live in segregated communities, they develop their own sort of communities, their own sort of community bonds. They may have their own political organizations, and they develop a sense of identification that becomes more important to them than their national identification. And when this happens, this self-identification as a minority leads to strains with the majority, particularly when minorities tend to form political groups based entirely upon ethnicity. That tends to create a counter-movement on the part of the majority to have their own political movements based upon their majority ethnicity and creating more social tensions. So, when I began this work, I began to wonder, really, are diversity and segregation just the same thing with different names? Because this is something that I was criticized for originally, and particularly by Putnam, who heard of my work secondhand from a former colleague of his who found out about my work, told him about it. He said, well, you know, basically the same thing. Doesn't really matter what you call it. So let's take a look at this. And we have two hypothetical communities here. Please pardon my poor presentation skills with PowerPoint here. On the left is a community where every blue person lives on one side of the railroad tracks. Those are supposed to be railroad tracks. Every red person lives to the right side of the railroad tracks. There's no interaction. The railroad tracks separate. Figure 2, every red person lives next to a blue person. Every blue person lives next to the red person. So what you see are two different societies. On the left, you have high segregation and high diversity, or fractalization as it's called in the academic literature. On the right, you have low segregation, in fact, zero segregation, but still the same level of diversity. So you can have a diverse society where everyone interacts with each other and intermingles with each other, or you can have a diverse society where everyone is segregated. Diversity and segregation are not the same thing. Now, it would be nice if everyone lived in a diverse neighborhood, an integrated neighborhood. But simply living in an integrated neighborhood is not enough to produce trust or other forms of social cohesion. Because you can live in this neighborhood, and if you never go outside or you just walk by people, you won't have any real contact with them. So what I argue in my book is that you need to have both an integrated neighborhood that's diverse and friends of different backgrounds. So you actually have to take advantage of the integrated setting for this to matter. So, again, you have to live in a well-integrated city and diverse social ties. Now, segregation is far more important because they're different things. And I'm going to first talk about a comparison I made with the US and the UK. This talk was originally done when only that was done. The book actually covers 5 countries, and I'm going to try to talk about them all very briefly. The United States, obviously, because I'm American, but that's not why I did the United States. I did the United States because it has the most severe segregation of basically any modern Western democracy. I did the UK because it's a very interesting comparison. It is becoming far more diverse, one of the more diverse countries in the West. Then I did Canada because it's right next to the United States, but with a very different cultural tradition. Australia, because I was there for 4 months, and that was part of the grant that I had to go there. But it also has a very interesting sort of history itself. And Sweden, because I have some ties here, but also because Sweden turns out to be A, a wonderfully fascinating story, and B, perhaps a good clue as to how the problem needs to be solved. I'm not saying that Sweden has completely solved it, but I'm saying compared to the other 4 countries, it's done a whole lot better job. So, what I show in the book is that having diverse social networks in integrated communities does indeed lead to higher levels of trust. And this relationship holds for the United States and also initially for the United Kingdom as well. And I don't want to go into all the statistics of how I did this. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to explain this. But originally we had these findings. Now what's fascinating is 2 things. One, the relationship holds for the United States with greater force than anywhere else for one simple reason. It has the biggest gap to overcome. The US is far more segregated than any place else. So the gains by interacting with people in integrated neighborhoods are much greater. Probably as much as 3 times as great as for the United Kingdom. The second thing is, for the United States, the biggest impact lies for the majority white population because the whites have less contact with minorities than the minorities have with whites. This is simply a matter of math. So if minorities are 30% of the American population and each minority person has 10 friends, chances are that those friends will include some whites. But if you're part of the majority, 70%, particularly if you're living in large sections of the country where there are no minorities, the chances are much less that you're going to have any friends who are minorities. Interestingly enough, for Britain, these relationships hold for every group, regardless of majority or minority status. The interesting cases in Britain are, 1, South Asians, primarily Hindus from India. They have the biggest gain from interacting with people of different backgrounds and living in integrated communities. The weakest effects are for Muslims, who tend to be discriminated against and to have fewer social ties than other groups in Britain. So basically, the results for the United States are really, really powerful. Gains of up to 27% in trust for whites. Now, one of the things that does happen is, yes, if you are living in a diverse neighborhood, you become less trusting. But 2 things. One is the effect of diversity is overwhelmed by the effect of living in an integrated neighborhood with friends of a different background. segregation or integration plus having close friends matters a whole lot more than diversity. Secondly, what diversity really is sort of a proxy for the percent minority. And we know minorities are less trusting. They have every right to be less trusting. So we don't really have necessarily the thing that people simply become less trusting, less civically engaged, just because they're living next to people who look different from themselves. And here are some of the sort of statistical analyses here, which just shows you that for big impacts for segregation, for whites, for blacks as well. But the one thing where whites get an even bigger group boost is if they live in an integrated neighborhood and belong to clubs where people are of a different background. Very small effect, actually even in the wrong direction for African Americans, mostly because they don't belong to that many integrated clubs. And that's an issue in itself. So we see the same thing for the UK. And I'm just going to pass this by. There are the effects for the UK. They're actually generally almost a bit bigger for whites than for other groups. Let's look at Australia and Canada now, because they tend to form a very interesting pattern. The effects in Australia and Canada are pretty similar to those in Britain. But they have a very different way of handling diversity in Australia and Canada. You just can't move in to Australia. You can't just move into Canada. Particularly, it's really difficult to move into Australia. We have in the United States this thing, the Statue of Liberty. You've all heard of it. And it has this big, big sign saying, "Give us your poor, you're tired, you're poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." The idea is the United States is a country of immigrants, of poor immigrants, huddled masses. Who goes to Canada, and especially who goes to Australia? Your middle income, highly educated professionals yearning to earn more money than they could back where they came from. In fact, in Australia, your typical immigrant has a higher level of education than your typical native-born Australian. So they solve the diversity problem really simply. They don't let in people who don't seem to fit the professional model. Now that's an interesting way of handling diversity, but it's not the way that's facing most Western countries right now. So it's not surprising, especially in Australia, that you have such well-integrated, high-trusting, civically engaged immigrants, especially from Asia. They can already come into the country that way. So let's look at the fifth country in this story, Sweden. Now, Sweden doesn't have what are called the point system for bringing immigrants in. But Sweden also has a very high level of trust among its immigrants. Why is this? Well, as I've argued together with my colleague at the University of Gothenburg, Bo Rothstein, and we're actually working on another paper on this as well, the universal social welfare state helps build up trust by not discriminating against recipients of benefits. So in the United States, if you get benefits from the government, you're sort of treated as undeserving, you're treated as a supplicant, someone who comes in and has to beg and is treated badly by bureaucrats. I don't have to tell people here in Sweden, you don't have this. You have a universal welfare state where everyone is entitled to the same benefits. This equality in providing benefits is a substantial factor in building up social cohesion. It also is a substantial factor in reducing inequality. So Sweden hasn't solved the problem completely, but it has, comparatively to the other countries that I've looked at, much greater equality, much lower levels of segregation, and its social welfare state is basically the cause of why people feel that they can have trust in their fellow citizens. And I can actually show this with my statistical analysis. It's also the case that in Sweden, unlike Canada, unlike Australia, contact with the majority builds trust for minorities. So, the lower level of segregation. Now, I know people are going to tell me about parts of Gothenburg and parts of Stockholm and parts of Malmö that are highly segregated, but it's always compared to something else. And compared to what we see in other countries, Sweden seems to be doing a pretty good job. Now, how do we handle this? Well, the UK and Sweden both have policies designed to foster integrated neighborhoods. And one of the things that has been problematic in both countries is the fact that these policies weren't sufficient. The United States has had some pretty weak policies on this. And both Sweden and the UK have largely abandoned these policies to go to a more market-based approach, such as you see in the United States and Canada and Australia. And to the extent that segregation may be increasing in Sweden, it may be to some extent because you have a situation where this policy has been sort of turned aside and the market has now become critical. But the other thing that I've found in my work is that, yes, there is sort of some racism going on. And this racism basically reflects where people choose to live. Because you can't just redesign neighborhoods by saying, you move here, you move there, and you need to move next to an Ethiopian, and you need to move next to an Indian, and you need to move next to someone from Romania. Doesn't happen. People, given the freedom of choice, generally tend to prefer, particularly if you're the majority group, to live in an overwhelmingly majority neighborhood. Now, minorities prefer to live in more integrated neighborhoods, but they are not at complete freedom to choose who all their neighbors are. And many minorities, particularly in the United States, fear that if they move into an all-white neighborhood or a mostly white neighborhood, that they will not be greeted very nicely. So what we have now in parts of the United States, right outside of the Washington, D.C. area where I live, is the growth of an upper-class, almost all African-American community. Homes costing well over $1 million. I can't afford that. Black professionals. And they move there because they say they would feel uncomfortable moving into a white neighborhood. And this is sort of the sign of the difficulty in creating integrated neighborhoods. Now, in the UK and Sweden, we do have evidence that ultimately minority groups do move out of segregated neighborhoods into more integrated neighborhoods. But again, we see signs in both countries of some increasing segregation due to more immigration. Immigrants are naturally going to come to communities with people like themselves. They need to sort of adjust to their new host country. Over time, they will move out, but the more immigrants come, the more segregation rises, at least in the short term. And now, for something a little bit more controversial, in case that wasn't controversial enough, what I'm going to argue is that it's not just housing policy. To some extent, to a considerable extent, it's policies dealing with inequality, but it's also policies dealing with how immigrants integrate into their host countries. And this is the argument that I make on multiculturalism, which is very much in vogue in many parts of the world today. It was actually invented in Canada by former Prime Minister, or late Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, as a way to sort of get over the divide between Anglophones and Francophones by saying, we are not a two-nation country, we are a nation of hundreds of different nationalities. And the attempt to put down Quebecois nationalism, which didn't quite work too well. But the notion of multiculturalism is sort of a form, not of residential segregation, but of social segregation. And it goes against the core notion in trust that we are all have something in common. And so I'm arguing that multiculturalism as a policy is also inimical to the building of trust. It hurts the building of trust. You can say you can be an Eritrean in the morning, a Swede in the evening, a Pakistani in the afternoon, a Brit in the evening, and have a sense of dual identity. But one of the things that my research has shown is that groups with the strongest sense of ethnic identity, as opposed to identity with the host country, have the lowest levels of trust. Because this creates this sense of, we are different from you. We are not all part of one community. So multiculturalism works against this notion of a common identity. Now, the problem is, it's not always easy to establish. And it's not easy to establish because there has to be something to integrate to. And this means that it is very, very much incumbent on the host population to provide a sense of national identity that is encompassing of people of different backgrounds. And I've already talked about this, so that's basically what I was going to say on this. But let me just finish this other thing up on multiculturalism. The core thing that we need to do is to focus on how minorities and majorities interact with each other. And since I said the core basis of trust is equality, it must be on the basis of equality. It doesn't mean throwing out the majority culture, but it means finding a place within that culture for people of different backgrounds. Now, the place that's done this the best is actually the United States, because it's very easy to become an American. But while the United States has done this the best, it's also not done it very well because of the extremely high level of inequality in the United States. Other countries have lower levels of inequality, but they have more of a sense of what is it to be a Swede? What is it to be a Brit? What is it to be an Australian? And here is the ultimate tension of trying to get diversity coming together to form some sort of common bond so that we can all work together. And I think that that's sort of running a little bit out of my time, so I will...
No, we still have a few minutes, but we can take 2 or 3 questions from the audience.
Not in Swedish, please.
Yeah, hopefully in English. Yeah?
I don't have any questions, but I have some thoughts to say, actually. I'm quite bored of asking questions. I like to give them thoughts. So I think, in Sweden, we personalize ourselves in our working, let's say, our work. That's our personality. We don't define ourselves as a person. So it can be a car mechanic or a lawyer or someone else. And there we build our walls to each other. So it's harder to meet the other group. So that's the first thing we have to do, is to learn who we are as a person and what quality we have as a person. Then we can meet other human beings. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay. Can I just comment on that? Yeah. You're absolutely right. And one of the things that I also show is that people who identify, this is from the British survey I analyzed, people who identify with their interest, their occupation, their education, they have very good, strong bridging ties. They have high levels of trust. The people with the lowest levels of trust are people who identify, A, with their ethnic group, their religion, where they came from, and most importantly, what the neighborhood they live in. The more you identify with your neighborhood as your primary sense of who you are, the less you're going to be connected to the rest of your society. So yes, be a lawyer, be an accountant. That's a good way to identify, because what does a lawyer look like? A lawyer can look like anything. Male, female, black, white, Asian, whatever.
Yeah. Hello, my question is, what about if you go the other direction, to the east? What happens then? Have you studied how it is in, say, Russia and the countries between Russia and Europe?
Okay, good question. Two things on this. One is that the people in formerly communist countries have very low levels of trust, very low levels of social bonding or bridging. To a considerable extent, that's because of the legacy of communism, but also to another extent, it's because of growing inequality that has occurred since transition. Now, in terms of segregation and diversity, I haven't really looked at this because I don't know of any really good measures that have been calculated for segregation and diversity based upon populations there, and I don't know of too many surveys that would let me look at these things in the same way I did in the Western countries. So it's not that it's unimportant or uninteresting, it's that the data don't let me look at this now. I would not want to make too many inferences because I don't know too much detail about many transition countries, but there is one that I do know about, and that's Romania. And in Romania, there is a pretty strong level of segregation between ethnic Romanians and ethnic Hungarians. This has caused, again, a high level of in-group trust and a low level of out-group trust, or generalized trust, as well as not a small level of social tensions. In fact, now I think this is gone now, but some years ago they actually used to have waiting areas for buses with a little, what do you call it, not chairs, but a place to sit. And they were painted in the colors of the Romanian flag. What did that mean? Hungarians weren't allowed to sit there. It was sort of like the old segregation in the United States. And one of the things that communism did is it hid a lot of these ethnic tensions that came back to life once communism died. So you see this in some of the former communist countries that still are still going through this. So the problem is not unique to the West. Where you don't find it is very simple. Find me a country that doesn't allow immigrants, you don't have this problem. But then they have other problems.
Okay, that's fine. And then Ingmar will give you a small gift.
I just want to say thank you, and here's a book from Bergsjön, closed, and its name's Bergsjön from the Inside, as a memory. Thank you very much.